Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another TravelMole podcast during this pandemic period, which seems to be going on and on and on. And as far as the UK travel industry is concerned, it's probably the worst situation and the most depressing situation we've been since the Second World War. I happen to have on the other end of this telephone line, this internet line, the CEO of UKInbound, who is probably feeling the brunt of it more than anybody, and that's Joss Croft. Good morning, Joss.
Morning, Graham.
It's a sorry situation, isn't it, Joss? We seem to be going from the devil to the deep blue sea all the time. You know, we're going from one crisis to the next. One point we feel as if we have some optimism about people coming back into the UK and indeed people travelling out of the UK. And then at the last minute, for seemingly no good reason in terms of the data, which seems like secret data, it's taken away from us. And the optimism, the thing that kills you is the hope, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it's been like this since the beginning of this pandemic, and you're right in terms of the desperate state of this of the industry. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this. And you know, we had hoped in November time, you know, when there was talk about the vaccines, that maybe we could be up and running by Easter. And then we got towards after Christmas, things looked really dire. But then they started to pick up. The vaccine dividend was being delivered. And we'd really hoped that had given us a huge competitive advantage. And I think if we'd been allowed to start trading at that point, then, you know, things would have looked a lot brighter. But it's not just the fact that we've not been able to trade, which everyone wants to do. They want to trade their way into recovery. But if we're not able to trade, then I think it's been very disappointing, the lack of government support. And some of that is built around maybe just not quite fully understanding the supply chains in travel and tourism and how it all works. But yeah, it's a very, very difficult time. I think there is still hope. There is still the hope of some business for this summer, particularly the individuals. For group travel, time is running out given the lead-in times as well. And a lot of UK attractions, UK hotels rely upon that group business as well. And of course, the operators do as well. So it's still a desperately challenging situation. And it's up and down. And, you know, rather like life itself, Graham, you know, you have good days and learning days. And you've got to try and turn those learning days into good days. But it is difficult. It's, you know, the human stories that we're starting to hear are really, really, really hard to take. And but of course, that just kind of adds weight to the work that we're doing and the requirement why we need to do it.
There's a huge cacophony of issues, I think, but the public opinion may be that, well, if everybody's staying at home, then what are you moaning about? You know, all the tourism industries, the hotels will be full. You can't get in anywhere. Pubs are full. Restaurants are full. You know, what's your issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, domestic is massively important. Of course it is, you know, and that's providing the immediate sort of pipeline of jobs and, you know, providing some generation for the UK economy. And of course, it's worth recognising that, you know, without a successful domestic tourism economy, you can't have a successful inbound economy because inbound tourists want to travel to the destinations that Brits travel to as well. And it's you know, great that the domestic market has been able to reopen to a certain degree, but of course the fact that the social distancing measures not having been removed for another 4 weeks means that many businesses aren't able to operate at full capacity. And it's only typically within a lot of particularly hospitality venues, they only start to make a profit at 70-80% capacity. So if they're not able to reach that 60-70% capacity anyway, through the social distancing restrictions, it means that it's giving them a real problem in terms of barely breaking even. And of course, whilst domestic, as I say, is massively important, domestic visitors spend a third of what inbound visitors do. So making up that shortfall would actually require an additional 55 million visits, domestic visits, to make up for that shortfall. And Visit Britain's predicting that it's only going to be at a 56% level of 2019 anyway. So we've got some really, really big problems, even with domestic seemingly doing well. And if you kind of put your head under the bonnet, you'll see that coastal might be doing well, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the kind of hinterland 2 or 3 miles inland. Rural might be doing well, but the cities cannot and will not do well until international visitors come back. And by that, I'm not just talking about London, but obviously London is the gateway to the rest of the UK. But it's the Edinburghs, it's the Manchesters, it's the Cardiffs, it's the Liverpools. And without any city workers, and then with no international visitors on top, I think there's a big, big problem there. And again, one of the other issues that I think a lot of tourism businesses would recognise at the moment as well is that there are real employment issues. Some of my members, hotel chains, in very popular domestic locations are only able to open at about 80% at the moment. And that's because they just simply cannot get the staff to fulfill the needs of their customers, to give the quality service that they need to give as well. So I think, all of that together means that domestic on the surface might look strong, but actually as the economic driver that we know that it should be, and the prelude to the international visitation, which is the 28.4 billion in exports, we've still got some significant challenges ahead, Graham.
Do you think, Joss, that one of the issues, and it's not just a short-term issue, it's been a historical issue, and unless it's changed, it's going to continue, is that at the very highest level of government, that there is really no understanding of the tourism industry, its multiplier effects in the economy, the employment levels, the foreign revenue it brings in, and there's a rather naive view that we can just carry on without any inbound tourists, without any outbound tourism, that everything will be okay because Britain is strong on its own, and that's a rather naive view. And going forward, the understanding of tourism and travel generally needs to be better understood in order for us to avoid not issues like this, because hopefully the pandemic will go away, but other issues that may arise in the future.
Yeah, we have been ceaselessly trying to educate politicians, parliamentarians on the workings of tourism, because it is quite complicated. We do have supply chains. We've got the intermediaries who bring in 50% of all the tourists into the UK, and I'm not necessarily sure the government recognises that, because the way that a lot of Brits travel is booking direct rather than through the operators for their short haul trips. They don't understand that internationally the use of intermediaries is much, much higher than it would be in the UK. I think there's some confusion around what tourism is generally. It's not just pubs, it's not just hotels. They are important parts of the visitor economy, but it's not the same as aviation, it's not the same as the intermediaries and wider tourism as well. And there's been a big focus upon retail premises rather than those supply chains and the tour operators and intermediaries, which I think has been very, very disappointing. But we've got a government that is adopting a very much a zero risk approach to this pandemic. And in travel and tourism, we're in the business of managing risk on a daily basis, whether that is the airplanes up in the sky and obviously the risk management around that. We started to see some improvements that might help. The government last week issued their tourism recovery plan, and a bit of a curate's egg. That it's very light in terms of what actions the government is going to undertake to really get the international side of tourism going. But there's some good stuff in there as well. So I think one of the most significant things, and it's very difficult to get excited about this type of thing, Graham, and interdepartmental ministerial meetings doesn't sound very sexy and cool, does it? But actually having a commitment from the government that they are going to have interdepartmental discussions around tourism is critical, because it's not just the Department for Culture, Media and Sport that should be responsible and accountable for tourism, but we rely upon BEIS, we rely, as everyone has seen, the Department for Transport, Health and Social, DEFRA, and Rural Affairs. So I think having a whole government approach is really, really critical. But in terms of whether government, this government is, all governments work quite short term anyway, but in a pandemic, the government is really, really looking on a day by day, a week by week basis. And at the moment, it's around managing the pandemic, it's around trying to get domestic going. But I think, we have so many things coming up in the future. You've only got to look at next year around the Commonwealth Games, around the Festival of the UK, around the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. These will only, and if you take it even wider, things like the UK's position in the world, this global Britain, this Atlantic Alliance, post-Brexit trading, all of these rely upon having a successful travel and tourism sector in the UK. So the government will have to understand it. And I mean, we continue to try to educate them through letters, through conversations with ministers, with officials, with business advisors to the Prime Minister. So we have to keep on fighting, and it's not a lost cause, Graham. This is a journey rather than just a fixed point in time.
Okay, well, on the face of it, it would appear that what they're trying to do is actually give you a bucket of water to put out a firestorm in the inferno of travel and tourism. But having said that, it would appear that the borders are not going to be open anytime soon. You know, the reality is that we're not going to get a sudden inrush of overseas visitors anytime before, probably, if we're being pessimistic, the end of the year, let alone the end of the summer. So what does the government need to do right now? If you were the minister in charge, you had a checkbook, you had powers, what does the government need to do right now?
Well, I think, many parts of the economy are now starting to open up, and we will see that increase, hopefully, touch wood, as of the 19th of July. But as you say, travel and tourism, particularly inbound travel and tourism, we were the first hit, we're the deepest hit, and we will be hit for the longest. And yet at the same time, many of the support measures that have been offered to industries which are now open or will soon be open have excluded a lot of parts of travel and tourism. So we need to see a sector-specific recovery fund that allocates grants to tour operators and DMCs that are reliant on international travel. Now, I know my colleagues who are involved in outbound will be making a similar case for them as well. And then if you look wider across the visitor economy itself, recognizing that, cities are in desperate straits, the short-term prospects for cities are not great, we need to be extending furlough for a minimum of 6 months as well. We've got business rates relief coming to hit us as well. So we now need to see some type of exemption from that, extending the relief without any tapering for, again, another minimum of 6 months. And I think what we've also got to do is not just support the industry, but allow it to trade. So, we've had this big announcement about this Atlantic Alliance, but where is the US on that green travel list? And when is the US, our most important market, going to start to be able to travel to the UK? So we've got to get rid of some of the testing requirements that our competitors have done for those who are vaccinated. That just strikes me as completely nuts. You've got people, elderly Americans, average age group 63, doubly vaccinated, want to travel to the UK, but they're not being allowed to, and so they are switching their business. And it just strikes me as not necessarily a risk managed approach, but very much a zero risk. And then, of course, longer term, we've got to have a look at some of the areas around some of the deep systemic issues around Brexit, the removal of ID cards as a form of entry documentation from the EU. That comes in as of the end of September. So, at just a time when we might be opening up, we're putting another barrier in front of people to stop them coming here. So it needs a kind of and we talked about it earlier on, but this all government approach. We need the Home Office to be looking at ID cards. We need the Department for Health to be looking at vaccination certification. We need, the Department for Transport looking at the number of countries that we've got on the green list, and we need the Treasury to be looking at recovery funds. So it requires an all government approach to this. And of course, we have a Department for Culture, Media and Sport, Digital Culture, Media and Sport, who do fight our case, but they are not pulling the levers of power. Those sit within the Cabinet Office, Health, and indeed the Treasury, as well as the number 10 as well.
Given the background of travel and tourism, it's always been a relatively conservative industry with a small c. We're now getting to the stage where you're one of the organisations that are supporting a protest day in London next week. Do you really think that's going to be of any use, of any effect?
Well, it's not as if we haven't been doing anything since day one of this, Graham. We have been lobbying government. We were successful in applications to the Scottish government for an international fund. We've been undertaking letter writing campaigns. We have had some success on some of the ARG grants, albeit they're very minimal. So it's not as if this is just popped out and the first thing that we're doing. And I would rather term it as a day of action rather than a day of protest. Actually, it's the opportunity for the whole of the industry to get together, to urge the government and the devolved administrations to really speak up for international travel. It's not just, again, the activities that will be taking place in Westminster, but there's a huge amount of other activities that we need to be undertaking: the social media storm, the letter writing campaign, the engagement with MPs, the media activations. So we're hopeful that the day itself will be able to amplify the voices of the businesses themselves. And I think this is a key point as well, Graham. is that it may be that some of the associations who are helping to pull this thing together, but it's actually the opportunity for the voices of the industry, the stories that you're hearing on a day-to-day basis around business failure and the personal impacts that that has upon people's lives. So it's the opportunity for them to have their voices heard, and for the industry to try and amplify those voices as well. You know, it's been very difficult. We haven't been able to have this type of event due to the restrictions, and even now, the restrictions with the delay that we heard about on Monday evening, you know, it still puts a lot of pressure in terms of how we pull this type of thing together. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing, that abiding by the COVID restrictions and making sure that the attendees and the public are safe has absolutely got to be our number one priority. But we will all, as an industry, be asking government to look at trying to bring back travel and tourism safely, sticking to their risk-based approach, and starting to expand that list so that we can then trade. But we also need to try and get government to bring forward that package of tailored financial support to help the industry. I think one of the, you know, if you want to put a silver lining on it, it is the opportunity for travel. And this has been a criticism of travel and tourism in the 35 years that I've been working in it, is that we don't speak with a single voice. And this does set a really good precedent of inbound, outbound, domestic intermediaries all working together to really try and raise the profile of our industry, to try and effect some change that will help us get through this difficult period. So I think it's a great opportunity. It's an opportunity to discuss with MPs. It's not just happening in London, it's happening across the United Kingdom. So the opportunity to really try and get our message heard and to lobby safely as and where we can.
So if I was listening to this and I'm a travel agent, or I own a pub, or I own a laundry who's going into hard times because there's nobody going to hotels as much as they used to, what should I do? What's the best way for me to contribute?
Excellent. Okay, well, that's a great question. Well, I think, you know, certainly in terms of writing to the MP, if you're attending the event on the 23rd, whichever event that is, trying to get some time with your MP, either through a virtual meeting or a physical meeting itself. It's about seeking out your MP's Twitter handle and using some of the assets that are being produced to try and get that message across to them. It's about attending the event if it's safe to do so, and you can register on the system so that we don't overload the allowed capacity that the police have allowed us. So I think what we've got to do is, you know, I do want people to be raising their voices, but a really important point is that there is a difference between influencing government and simply getting angry, and we need to strike that balance. We need to have our voices heard, but at the same time, rather, as I mentioned before, this is a journey. We will need to engage with government over the next year, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. So we do need to be able to influence them at the same time as remaining measured and solution orientated as well.
Good. Finally, do you think that you have public opinion behind you? Because you can quite easily see on social media, in the daily newspapers, on the television, when people are interviewed, yes, you get people that are saying, right, you know, I'm desperate to go on holiday and I don't know why we're not, against people that say, no, we should shut the borders, and had we done so a lot earlier, a lot quicker and all the rest of it, then we'd be better off than where we are now. So getting our message across, or getting the travel industry message across, is very dependent on public opinion. Do you get a feeling that we have that behind us as an industry?
It's really fascinating, this one. I and the team, actually, we regularly look at the Ipsos Mori and the YouGov polling, which looks at, there's two key real indicators that we look at when we're looking at the type of activities that we undertake to influence government. The first of which, it looks at the percentage of the UK population that would really rather that we had no inbound flights at all. And there's another one that looks at the percentage of the UK population that believes that every person coming into the UK should be undertaking quarantine. Now, those figures are decreasing, but they're still quite high. You know, you're looking at about 40% of people that don't believe we should be having any flights into the UK at the moment. So politicians will reflect that. You know, that's what they do. They reflect public opinion. They do shape public opinion as well, but they also reflect it as well. And I think, you know, if you look at those polls, they are decreasing in terms of the resistance to inbound and outbound travel. And we know that the more that people want to travel and are able to travel overseas, that those figures will decrease as well. So we've got to really be, be looking at those and taking that into account. But, if we can undertake opening in a safe way that doesn't jeopardize anyone, and I mentioned previously, perhaps looking at people who have been doubly vaccinated with recognized vaccines, then there's simply no reason why they shouldn't come in. We have a huge amount of events happening next year that we really need to be starting to plan for. We've got to start getting business in and starting to turn those inquiries that my members are now getting for the rest of this summer and into next year. We now just need to start confirming those into hard bookings, so that when people are feeling more comfortable about traveling, and infrastructure exists to allow them to do so as well. So I think, like all of these things, it's around balance, and it's around kind of managed risk rather than wholly going one way, we should open up with no restrictions, or going the other way, we should never open up at all. And I do think it's a little bit about that balance of risk. I mean, one thing I would say as well, Graham, is that, whilst we recognise, because, this is where everything pivots on government policy in terms of reopening and the support for the industry, but there's a lot that we can do ourselves as well. As an industry association, we're undertaking a lot of activities to try and benefit our members, whether those be kind of business improvement webinars. Today, actually, we launch a group welcome charter for accommodation providers to be able to provide fair terms and conditions for operators, which will hopefully help both operators and accommodation providers as well. We continue with our events. We've got our convention next year. So there's a lot that the industry can do. But there's also, as I say, a heavy reliance around government policy as well. But I think it is a balance on all of these things, Graham. It shouldn't necessarily be totally black or white. There is some grey in the middle. We should be sophisticated enough to be able to deal with that grey middle.
Fair enough. Well, I wish you the very best of luck. I hope the day of action, as you've termed it, as opposed to protest, is successful. If I don't see you before, I shall see you when we're manning the barricades.
Fantastic.